Evening, everybody. I'm Lizzie. I am the Social Justice Project Worker for SEM, and I've organised this roundtable tonight following some feedback from some of our workshops with some of our members who wanted to discuss the ethics of activism and campaigning and when we should and shouldn't do action. I'm joined by four wonderful speakers tonight, and they're each going to introduce themselves. So I'll pass first to Chris, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm a 50-something Catholic, Roman Catholic. I live in Dorset, in Shaftesbury, in Dorset. And for my day job, I run a small campaigning organisation called Drone Wars UK, which researches and campaigns against the military use of drones. But I've also, for a long time, more than 30 years, been involved in peace activism, mainly focusing on the arms industry and the arms trade. And that's had a variety of consequences, from arrest to prison to injunctions and ASBOs and things like that. But also some successes as well. And most recently, we had our conviction for blockading the Dicey Arms Fair overturned at the Supreme Court, which ruled that disruption at sometimes these events was legitimate. So that's me in a nutshell.
And now we'll go to Martha, please.
Hi, I'm Martha. I'm a first-year engineering student in Cambridge, and I'm involved in the SEM group in Cambridge. I've also been involved in climate activism in a range of different ways. I took part in the school strikes in 2019 and early 2020. And I've also been involved in less non-violent, I've also been involved in sort of more conventional kind of campaigning within the Methodist Church, particularly on fossil fuel divestment. And also my mum, who sadly can't be with us today, got arrested with Extinction Rebellion. So I have some experience of being on the periphery of Extinction Rebellion.
Fabulous, thank you, Martha. And we'll go to Michael now, please.
Sorry?
Say who you are.
Oh, Michael Pulham. And we've been involved in working against nuclear weapons a lot. Patricia and I, my wife. And we've also done other things as well. We've stood outside our council offices, for example, for several hours in support of
school strikes.
The school strikes and so on. And we've done a lot of things like that. British Nuclear Fuels on the Wirral at Capenhurst was one place where we did a lot of activity. And it's a place where nuclear material is produced for Trident. And we had quite a long time campaigning there. What else have we done? Oh yes, we're linked with interfaith work. I've spoken at the Buddhist Peace Pagoda in Battersea Park several times to the crowd. And we're thinking about Freshers Week now, because many students need to know about situations in the world that are threatening the world. For example, if there's the risk of nuclear accident or war, that would accelerate global warming rapidly.
I'm Patricia, as you probably gather, and I got involved in, we always called it activism, though I really do believe there's no hierarchy of work for peace. But in the beginning, in about 1982, where I was involved in never living in Greenham, not for more than about 2 weeks at a time. But we had a large family, and I got involved quite a lot in civil disobedience at various nuclear bases, and none of which I could have done without the support of Michael, because we had a large family, and this was something we had to talk about first. And Michael said, I said, may I do this? And Michael said, not only may you, I think you should. Because I suddenly felt called both as to use civil disobedience as a witness, as a means of communication, and as an actual physical way of stopping things. Mm. So that's really how I got involved, and through arrests and prison for a number of times for about 10 years. And then we moved to other forms of activism. And the reason I changed things was because after a while I became an adrenaline junkie, I thought. And I was beginning to get sort of a bit too excited by it all. I certainly didn't start like that, but I began to look at my own motives later. And I have such admiration for people who have kept their motives pure. And I know most people do, but I was somebody who knew we then had to look at other ways of working. And there are many, many ways.
That's very true. As you can tell, for anybody watching at home, we've got a whole wealth of experience here. So if you have any questions, do just pop them onto the chat on YouTube and Ruth will send them over to us. But I'll start with the questions for the whole group. But I'll probably go to you first, Patricia, because you've touched on this. Obviously, you have experience of activism and direct action, and all of you have varying degrees of that experience. But how does your faith interconnect with this then? And you've talked about that a little bit, Patricia. I just wondered if you could tease it out a bit more about the idea of being called to do action.
I know the very first time I decided I would go and take part in that kind of direct action, it felt almost sacramental. It was something I did and we did together after a great deal of prayer. And because when one works in this, you work with a group of other supporters with different roles. And I think without my faith, I would never have had the courage to begin. And perhaps without my faith, I would never have had the courage to look at my own motives later.
Martha, how about you?
Yeah, I definitely have felt quite a strong calling to do something about the climate crisis. I think it started mostly in 2018 when there was the IPCC report that said that we had until 2030 to do something really drastic. And that was quite terrifying because I'll only be 27 then. And that was that's so short amount of time. And also then I was a bit inspired by Greta Thunberg as well. But I think my calling isn't just to activism, but also I'm studying engineering and I really want to have a career that can do something about the climate as well as working through activism. So I think it's really valuable that a call can be in all sorts of shapes and sizes.
Chris?
Yes, well, I mean, my faith is very much part of and behind my activism. I mean, as Patricia said, really, as Christians, we're called to be peacemakers and to follow Jesus, the peacemaker. And Jesus, was not a peacemaker as the world sees peacemaking. in terms of calming people down and, accepting the situation, but rather to challenge the kind of structures of the world that enshrine division and alienation and injustice. And one of the ways that Jesus did that was by challenging and confronting the powers in a way that we would now call direct action, open, direct challenges to institutions of injustice. And so for me, I see a kind of a real parallel really between the Christ of the Gospels and engaging in civil disobedience, direct action, challenging the powers today.
Michael, is there anything you would add in terms of how your faith interconnects to a call to action?
Yes, it's very important not to be too personal about this. Selflessness is important. You're not doing it for yourself at all. You're doing it for everybody. You're doing it for to carry out God's will in the first place, and for everybody else in creation, and for creation itself. The whole thing, you're doing this, and you have to forget that any pride that you might have in doing it yourself, and think of other people and of God's purpose.
That's the real answer, everyone. I think my next question will probably be, and I'll throw this open and see if anybody wants to answer it. It's collateral damage then, and the fact that we can never really work for social justice without causing harm to ourselves or to other people, because we're fighting to change the status quo, ever acceptable? Or is there a line that you probably wouldn't cross?
Yes. When Jesus sent his disciples out, he sent them out, as Matthew says, as sheep among wolves. We can't expect it to be an easy thing to do. We will face all kinds of difficulty, but nevertheless, we are doing God's will, and we can even get joy in doing that.
I think it can be a really interesting question when it comes to, for example, a lot of the Extinction Rebellion actions, like, were about blocking roads, and a lot of that was quite controversial in the press and in public opinion at times. And every now and again there was a story of, like, whether there was an ambulance that had been held up because of an action, and all sorts of people who maybe found it harder to get to work. And some people saying, oh, well, you're making all these cars sit and idling, and isn't that going to make it worse for the climate? And it is a difficult question at times, and you can't always, obviously you can never know for certain what the exact situation is going to be. But I think that certainly, in my opinion, with the climate, it is such a dire situation at the moment. And it's such a time-constrained situation, and there is so little being done by the powers that be, that we really have to do something. I would definitely stop at anything that was actively harming someone, because I would never want to harm someone. But when it comes to causing civil disobedience and potentially property damage, I don't know about that one. I think it might be necessary, and there is all sorts of illustrations that all throughout history of people undertaking civil disobedience. Especially, I grew up being inspired by the suffragettes and some of the stuff that they did.
Mm-hmm. When we began our direct action, you might call it, and we had meetings with other people, and we respected the zealousness of people who wanted to join in, but we knew that we need to sometimes give them a bit of advice, because just the act of getting yourself arrested could affect the rest of your career for your life, because it could crop up in various ways. So we used to mentioned this to people, but nevertheless respected their zealousness. And as, for example, people like Angie Zelter, who was on the radio this morning, they deserve respect for weighing all this sort of thing up and nevertheless going ahead with it. They know what they're taking on. They know the risks. They know what it might mean for their future. But nevertheless, it's such an important issue that they carry on.
Yeah. Just to add something to that, like when my mum made the decision that she was going to go and join in an Extinction Rebellion and went with the intention that she might end up getting arrested, and I made the decision, I mean, I wasn't going to go anyway because it was during the week and I was in sixth form still, but I made the decision that I, at this point in my life, didn't want to do something that would risk me getting arrested, because I'm so early in my life and I don't know what I might do with my career where there might be barriers if I had a criminal record or something. And I find it really valuable in groups like Extinction Rebellion that a lot of older people or people who are settled in jobs where a criminal record isn't going to be an issue can make that decision. My mum's a church minister and she communicated with her colleagues beforehand to check that it was going to be okay. But yeah, I think it's so important that the people who have the luxury of being able to take that risk can take it, and those that don't can do other things and be activists in other ways.
I think that's really important. I think that's really important, thinking about how our privilege plays into what we can and can't do. Chris or Patricia, do you have anything to add on that question?
Well, just in terms of...
I beg your pardon, Chris.
My fault, I threw it open to both of you.
No, just in terms of collateral damage, disrupting and annoying other people's lives, it is a difficult question, and I would agree with Martha that I would, and I'm sure all of us would see violence to people as a no-no, but where does disruption and damaging people's ongoing lives? But we have to kind of consider the alternative of that, of course, is doing nothing. Also, harm is a great deal of harm to people. Allowing things to remain as they are, allowing the status quo, is incredibly harmful to a lot of people on our planet. So we have to think about that as well. Sorry, Patricia, go ahead.
No. Yes, I just, as long as people are fully aware of how it might affect them, and then they make their decision, because certainly way back when we were getting arrested and things, it would stop you nursing, teaching, caring professions, even for the most minimal thing, just sitting down in the road and not getting up and not stopping a load of traffic. It could be very, very tiny. And I found that we've got a couple of daughters who live across the Atlantic, and one of them had recently a very sort of bad, sad period in her life in Canada. And I knew I had to get to see her. And we'd been to Canada many times with no problem. And I was refused permission to fly into Canada. From 30 years ago. Eventually I got there because they let you go in by road or by sea, or anyway, they just won't let you fly in. So I could go to America because I have a full visa there. But so my daughter said, I will drive you across the border and then you'll get there. But I mean, particularly if climate activism, you think, well, using aeroplanes is a very bad idea anyway, but you never quite know what your family circumstances will be. And if you have a family, you also have responsibilities there. But then for most of us who were parents and got involved in activism, that's why we got involved in activism to start with.
For the children.
For the children.
I think that leads on to a great question as well, in terms of, is there any activism you've been involved with, any of you, that you've then ever regretted afterwards?
Well, I mean, there have been a couple of actions that I've been involved in. I wouldn't go as far as regret, but I've certainly learned lessons from them. One I can think of where we use blood, where we kind of poured blood in an arms factory. Trying to kind of bring home, to this kind of sterile, clean office environment that was building, manufacturing weapons, and so we, took some of our own blood and put our own blood in there. But that was very shocking, and it really shocked and disturbed people, and it disturbed us as well, really, because there was something very. So I wouldn't go as far as saying I regret it, but I wouldn't do it again. So maybe there is some regret in there.
Does anybody else want to pitch in? You don't have to. I've got a question from the audience, if people would like that one instead. So the question from the audience is, what would your advice be for someone whose desire to do activism doesn't necessarily match with physical and mental health, what that would allow in terms of the physical and mental health? What would your advice be?
Well, at the risk of speaking too much, I would say there are, as we've already said here, that there are plenty of ways of being involved in activism. Activism doesn't have to involve demonstrations and protests and direct action. There are plenty of things to do: research, information, education, all kinds of things are valuable. And there isn't this idea that a hierarchy that you have to go do this, but there are plenty of things that can be done that all contribute towards building the kingdom. So it's very important to remember that.
I would agree with what Chris has said, and I think it's so, well, for one thing, it's so important that you look after yourself and that you do what you're able to do and what your situation allows. As I've already said, don't go and get arrested if that's going to put your situation either now or in the future at risk. But also, so much of the activism, especially when people go out and do nonviolent direct action, there's so much that has to go on in the background. I remember when I heard people from Extinction Rebellion speaking at Greenbelt a few years ago, and they said they have arrestable people and non-arrestable people, and they need way more non-arrestable people than arrestable people, because there's so much that has to go on in the background. And also, when someone who's arrestable, who's decided that they're willing to be arrested, goes and takes part in an action, there has to be someone with them who's not going to get arrested, who can keep an eye out for them, who can contact the family if they do get arrested, and look after their belongings and all those kinds of things. And also there's so many things that have to go on, maybe not at the site of an action, but in the background, and as Chris said, communication. So there's so many different ways that you can get involved in activism. But yeah, also look after yourself.
One very good way that everybody listening to this program, or taking part in it, or wherever they live across the country, is to support the Treaty for the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW. And they can do this by simply contacting their local authority wherever they live and saying, will you support this, please? Just wherever they live. That would cover the entire country. And it's something that people who are ill, who have some disability, they can do that very easily. Just contact your local council and say, we would like you to be one of the councils in the country which supports this treaty. And also, it would help too if they sent a copy of their letter to their local newspaper or their radio source. Thank you.
I think at the beginning I said I don't believe there's a hierarchy of action. That the person who wears a badge in public or holds a placard or knocks on a door and hands somebody a leaflet is as valuable as the person sitting down in front of a lorry. Because I did the sitting down business and I found it a great deal easier than approaching somebody and directly trying to change their minds. But everything is linked. It's like all justice issues are linked. And what's really important is building relationships with other people, and particularly the people who don't agree with you. You know, God loves them. He made them. Mm-hmm. You know, to be egoistic. And I really saw activism, even what we've always called direct activism, as a means of communication. And often, I mean, Michael didn't do that because he had to look after the children and keep a job so that he could feed them. But he is extremely imaginative. And we lived in the northwest then, that's why we could talk about Capenhurst, which is a very long way from East Sussex. We used to make sort of things that were visually very exciting, very, very much fun. And that way we could get the local press, the local television along. And that way you weren't necessarily doing anything very exciting or very confrontational.
We had lots of fun, didn't we?
We had lots of fun as well, and you need a bit of fun doing this. But it gave us a huge amount of publicity at the time.
I think one of the things, so from this workshop that I delivered, where we talked about these issues, one of the things that came out of that as well is the fact that we're not all comfortable chaining ourselves to buildings. Not everybody has that strength, but some people are really good at the admin, like at the organising the buses to get people there to protest, to be able to chain themselves to stuff. And actually, you need both sets of people. Like it takes a whole village of people to be able to run a campaign and to make change happen. And I don't think people should feel guilty if they don't feel comfortable doing the more radical things. I think you need all types. Yeah. So I think I would agree with what everybody said. So what prompted you all to get involved in activism? You've talked about it a little bit, especially more so talking about the fact that, you know, the climate crisis is something that's directly going to impact upon your generation. But was there anything else? And did somebody in particular inspire any of you? Shall I go to Martha? Is there anything you would add in terms of why you got involved? And was there any particular person that inspired you?
I think, as I said earlier, it was a chain of events, really, and a chain of opportunities as well. When, like, I was kind of aware in the news when Greta Thunberg first started doing the striking from school. And then as it became a movement that was spreading across the world, I was like, oh, I want to get involved in this. But I live in Cumbria and we don't have any major cities that are very nearby. And I was like 15 or 16 at the time. And I was like, oh, I'm not sure I can really do this because it's too far to travel to get to London, or even Manchester would have been quite far to go on my own at that age. Things like happening in like much smaller action, all sorts of different places. Wasn't everyone? I mean, there's a lot of places like London because of the visibility and the people and the things that are in London, but actually that anyone could building or march through the street. be visible and educate people. You know, actually, we weren't anywhere near anyone who was really making any laws, but I was in my local town with a placard, sat outside the town hall, and people would walk up and be like, "What are you doing here? Why are you sitting here?" And we would, and it was really a question, but.
And people came to speak to you, like, did you ever get any kind of negativity, or was it positive? Or
it was quite varied. I mean, I would say we didn't get anyone who was like really, really negative. We had some interesting people who had some interesting opinions about having people of different races make our movement strong. It was an interesting conversation. But we all had, it was interesting because in the youth led, we had some like cool volunteers who came along and supported us, and we had a parent with a very young baby who came along, which was really lovely. And we also, I think, to the biggest one, the local MP came along to show his face, even though his voting record showed that he wasn't necessarily being that helpful in that area. But yeah, I think the conversations were good, and like you'll always find people, like whether you're out like actually protesting or just in your daily life, who really don't understand at all why you're doing it. And education is so valuable because people don't necessarily realize. And if you live in a bubble of activism, or if you live in a bubble of just being aware of social issues, you might be thinking, well, everyone understands it, but actually so many people don't. And if they did, maybe they might be more concerned, and more people could get out there and make their voices heard about this.
I guess that's what comes into the point about research as well, and education Chris talking about. So going back to the original question about how everybody got involved in activism as well, and it's
recording in progress.
Chris, do you have anything to add?
Well, it's difficult. How far do you go back? I suppose for me, when I was very young, I wanted to go and save the world, go overseas and make the world a better place. And I suppose I, quickly realised and was quickly informed that I didn't have any particular skills, or there was nothing that I could particularly bring to Africa that would make the world a better place. And really learned, I suppose, that the kind of roots of the structures of injustice that are causing, death and destruction around the world are here, really. And it's here where we need, wherever you are is where you need to act. And for me, I got involved really through every year there is a liturgy of repentance at the Ministry of Defence on Ash Wednesday, where as part of the liturgy, people mark the building with blessed ashes and charcoal, resisting nuclear war, and in particular Trident. So in the 1980s, I was one of the people who was introduced to activism through that, really, and that was very helpful. That there were a group of people around. As Martha says, you start, when you start this, you're on your own. You think you're on your own, and it's vitally important, I think, to find other people. There are plenty of groups out there, either local groups or national organisations, where you can meet like-minded people and work together. So that's how I got involved.
Michael and Patricia, is there anything else you'd like to add about how you got involved, and if there was anybody in particular that inspired you?
So I first got involved with the women's movement, and there was somebody, a Quaker actually, who was a very sort of charismatic in many ways, and we started, both of us, with something that was a sort of Remembrance Sunday. Sunday, I don't know what you can call it. It wasn't a protest. It was Remembrance Sunday in Chester, where we lived, outside Chester Cathedral, and we had permission from the Dean of the Cathedral, we had permission from the mayor to actually have a placard that said, We mourn the dead, we respect their sacrifice, but in their memory, let us all work for peace. Now, that's hardly terribly radical, is it? But after that, we got hauled into the police station. And we thought, this is more important than we realized. And really, it went on from there, and we began to look at what was happening to destroy the prospects of world peace, first in our area. So Michael's talked about Capenhurst and what might stop our children growing up and everybody else's children too. And of course, there were other people involved, and that's really how it started, wasn't it?
Yes, yes, indeed, yes.
So really through one person who inspired me. And then I went home and got Michael involved.
Yes, yes, we could lift the telephone and hear a conversation that we'd had with somebody being recorded by the police. And outside our house, there was a car with a man reading a newspaper for a very long time.
When we'd done something so minimal as with permission to have really a prayer for the fallen and determination that there wouldn't be any more.
It's really funny because that's the kind of thing where, like, I only know about that kind of stuff from happening from later on, from protests kind of post-Iraq, and I never think about the fact that this was going on for much longer as well. That, yeah, I guess you'd almost be mocked if you took part in something that wasn't even that groundbreaking or shattering. How do you think we should think about the harm we may accidentally cause with activism and campaigning when we're doing it for a particular group if we don't make sure that that group is included or their voices are heard? Because I think that's a different ethical line to think about. And I just wondered if anybody had any thoughts about that.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question, Lizzie.
I was asking about how we should think about our ethical obligations when we're campaigning on issues that affect other people and it's their story as well, and how we think about the harms that that could potentially cause and how we balance that. So I guess it's about a question about being an ally and working with marginalised groups and how we make sure that our privilege isn't accidentally hindering them, and campaigning on issues related to them isn't actually causing more harm. So it's quite an in-depth question, is that one, I guess, but I think it's an important one to think about within activism. Martha looks like, yeah, I'm going to say Martha looks like something to say.
Yeah, I think it's really important that, like, activism, I mean, most of us have been, I think, campaigning for things like peace or the climate, which to a certain degree affects everyone, but affects some people more than it affects others. I know the climate movement has been criticised for being very white, for being very middle class at times. And I think that there's a lot of factors involved in that. One factor I've heard voiced is that, like, well, if you're in a more marginalised group, then maybe you're spending more of your time worrying about the things that affect you specifically in that identity. And actually those who are from less marginalised groups have more time to worry about things like the climate, which until recently haven't been seen to be a present issue, been seen to be a future issue. But it is so important, I think, that we do communicate and, like, that everyone can learn about the climate and about how it affects everyone. And I think it is so difficult because it's affecting a lot of people right now, especially people in the global south. And we don't want to speak for them. And especially, like, on global negotiation scales, like, it's really important that Indigenous peoples and people from the global south are being included in these conversations. At a local level, that obviously looks quite different potentially. But yeah, it's a difficult issue. But what I was going to get on to say is, as I said earlier, there are certain privileges which allow people to be able to take a part in action more easily, and that includes having more money, and being white and being female mean you're less likely to be as harshly treated by the police if you end up in that kind of situation. So there are so many different factors, and I think it's important to use your privilege and be aware of your privilege at the same time, and that looks different for everyone.
It's a really lovely answer. Thank you, Martha. Does anybody else have anything they want to add to that?
I mean, I would echo what Martha said about acting. We're not acting on behalf, or we're not speaking on behalf of other people, particularly when we're talking, for instance, we've been involved in campaigning in the 90s to stop arms exports to Indonesia. Indonesia was engaged in a genocide against the people of East Timor. And our actions, we very much listened to and learned from and worked in solidarity as best we could with the people of East Timor, but we weren't never and would never claim to be speaking on their behalf or acting on their behalf. But they very much wanted and encouraged us to act where we could, because, as Martha said, we had the privilege to be able to challenge BAE Systems and others who were supplying arms here where they couldn't.
Michael and Patricia, anything to add? It's okay if you don't. I think there've been some very great answers, but
I didn't know until several years later how badly my children had been affected, because they didn't tell me, because they didn't want to put pressure on me. And I didn't know how much bullying they had at school because of that, and how unpleasant many of the staff were to them. Because not so much they said you're horrible, but they more or less said your parents are crazy and ridiculous or causing all these problems, and I often wonder if I had known, if I would have stood back from it. Probably. I mean, Martha, you had a mother who'd been involved, didn't you, that way? But it didn't put you off, did it?
No, I mean, my mum hadn't, it wasn't like a repeated thing, or at least it hasn't been so far. I think she potentially would look to doing it again in the future, but COVID got in the way quite soon after her involvement. I think you talked about your children being bullied, and I know, when I found out that my mum had been arrested, I told a lot of my friends, and my brother told his whole school at the time. And actually, I think most people were very encouraging about it and very positive about it. My mum did face some difficulties with some people in the congregation at church, and also from the leadership of the schools, because she's a minister and she goes into assemblies, and they were a bit funny about having her back after she'd been arrested. But yeah, I think there's some things that you can predict and some things that you can't. But being communicating and listening to the people around you. I was very supportive of my mum, and I'm very glad that she did that in a way that I couldn't at the time.
Have any of your thoughts about activism changed, and what is acceptable and what's not? And would you do anything differently now? So not necessarily that you regret them, but would you, if you could go back, would you change any of the things that you've done or do them slightly differently? I'll go to you, Chris, for that one, if you don't mind.
I struggle to answer this one in terms of regret, because I'm not the kind of person who does regret things, really. I'm sorry, I just struggle to kind of answer that one particularly.
No, that's completely fine. Michael and Patricia, is there anything that you would do slightly differently if you could do it over again then?
No, I don't think so, but I think when I stopped working that way, not because it was a bad way to work, I'm convinced that it was right for me at the time, but when I saw that, shall we say, it was affecting me spiritually in the wrong way, then I stood back from it, but I still have a great deal of respect for those who do, and worked more on dialogue with people here and abroad. And sometimes you can't do both at once. In order to get into an embassy and things like that, you've got to be relatively respectable. So I have other opportunities, and Chris will know, but I very much value sort of prison experiences, because now I can pass my experiences and my knowledge on to people who can change things that way. So you can use so much there. All your experiences, whether they seem positive or negative at the time.
What advice would you give for somebody then, Patricia, who say they were about to get arrested for a protest and they were thinking about that? Would you give any advice to them? And like, yeah, how would you use your to a young campaigner comes to you and says, I want to get with direct action, I'm worried I might get arrested, or I'm worried about what the fallout might be? What would you say?
Well, Michael might be better at this because he used to be a careers counsellor. So he did have to.
Yes, there are questions like this. And it's important to have a good relationship with people and build on it. It isn't just the fact that we're doing this through Christianity. Lots of people are of the same mind about making the world a better place. And our campaigning doesn't just have to involve Christians. It can involve anyone who's interested, anyone who has a keenness to make things better in the world. Have lots of friendships to develop, and
it's important people who get involved with it, proper sort of information about how it might affect them, and then they decide that might arise on, or whether what, and because what they're doing is so essential and so important, but at least they know it could happen.
I think we'll talk a lot about kind of the negatives that people have experienced from activism, which I mean, feel free to talk about that a bit more. But how has campaigning and activism, how has it impacted upon your lives? And kind of what are the positives as well as the negatives? Because I don't want people to think that activism is all about the negatives.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Michael and Tricia have said about being prepared, and particularly if it's your first time to do it with other people in a community. But yeah, I mean, civil disobedience, direct action is very empowering. It really does affect your life and make you much more empowered, I think. But also, as Patricia and Michael said, it's fun. It can be a great deal of fun. I mean, it's often boring, in lots of different ways. But it's also fun. And I would encourage people appropriately, with great deal of thought, to get involved in civil disobedience and direct action. It's not the only thing to do, but it is certainly, challenging the structures that cause injustice and division and violence. We have to do. That's what we're called to do. So, yeah.
What do you think the first steps are to get involved with civil disobedience? I'm just thinking, if I was sitting at home now thinking, I really want to do something, but I don't know where to start.
Yeah. Well, I would encourage people to get involved, particularly in some of the Christian, if coming from a Christian perspective, to get involved in some of the Christian groups like Christian CND and Fellowship of Reconciliation. But there are plenty of other groups, National CND, Stop the War organisations, and lots of groups who are involved in different ways. And talk about it. Suggest, and particularly at the moment, there is a huge wave of environmental activism. So I think there are lots of opportunities that Martha could probably talk more about.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, well, the group that my mum got involved with, well, it was Extinction Rebellion, but Extinction Rebellion has it has lots of local groups, and it also has faith groups. So Christian Climate Action is the Christian wing of Extinction Rebellion. But I mean, there's also lots of other newer sort of direct action climate campaign groups that I'm not as aware of. All sorts of groups that have made the news, like Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain, that I don't know that much about. But yeah, find out about what local groups are near you, or just sign up on an email list. Like, I'm on the Extinction Rebellion email list, and then if they're planning something, then I'll get an email being like, we're planning this thing in this place at this time. And then you can be aware of what's going on and try and find other like-minded people as well. I think that's so important. And then I think I had much more confidence when I was doing things with other people. I mean, since I've sort of come along my activism and campaigning journey, I've been more confident to go on my own. A few months ago, I went to London from Cambridge on my own to join a vigil outside the Methodist Central Hall before the Shell AGM, which was happening there. And I just turned up on my own and didn't know anyone, and I spent the afternoon sat outside in the rain at times, which was fun and boring in equal measure at different times. But actually earlier on in my journey, I wouldn't have had the confidence to do that at all. And like when I first decided I was going to join in with the school strikes, I like told loads of people, and everyone was like, why on earth are you doing that, Martha? People were very surprised that I might be willing to bunk off school, because that wasn't the kind of person that I was. But actually, in the end, one of my friends came with me, and my little brother came with me with parental supervision, and we had a great time as well, like with other people, meeting new people, and shouting really loudly in the streets.
Yes, listening is an important technique for us all. Listening to people in order to connect with them and make friends. So we must use that technique as much as we can, rather than just talking at them.
Do you ever find dialogue hard, though, depending who you're having the dialogue with? Because I agree with, because Patricia said this, that dialogue is one of the most important things, but it's sometimes, again, I think that's a very specific skill that some people have, is being able to sit in dialogue with people whose views sometimes are very different to your own. Go on, Patricia, sorry.
Yes, you have to remember that. I remember having somebody sort of training us once, and he said, Fritters, if you're talking to the top of the armed, the head of the armed forces about pacifism, you're speaking on complete two languages, but there will be one step that you can take nearer to each other. There'll be something very small that they also can agree with. And then you gradually move closer. Because when you think of people who are really violent and you think, why are they like that? Because they're afraid, because they've lost confidence, because they've been badly treated. And that kind of caring about them helps you start the conversation.
I entitled this roundtable Radical Action to Defeat Radical Evil, and Where is the Moral Line? And I think sometimes we forget as well that sometimes sitting down in dialogue and talking to people whose views are different to ours is in itself quite a radical act as well. And I think that's important to remember as well, that talking to people and listening, even when it's hard, is still really important. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I think we probably covered what my last question was going to be, which was what advice would you give to somebody starting out campaigning? But is there anything else that you would like to add before we end in terms of advice to people on starting their campaigning activism journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to see that activism isn't something that you go and do on a Saturday or whatever. Activism is part of our lives, and particularly when you're talking about dialogue and talking to people, we don't have to talk to the head of the armed forces. If you get that opportunity, that's wonderful. But it can often be our uncle or our work colleague or a school friend who you need to talk to and persuade of the value of peace and environmentalism and the ethical way to live, and so we can do that. We get many opportunities to do that. So our lives are activism, it's just not something you go and do.
That's a really lovely note to end on. Unless anybody has anything else they would like to add, I've got a couple of shout outs that I'll do in a minute from YouTube as well. But does anybody have anything they would like to add to what Chris has just said?
I think I would just reiterate, do what you are able to do and don't feel pressured to go out and do something that you don't feel comfortable doing or that would risk harming yourself or those around you. Everyone can do something. And so many different ways of activism are valuable.
Michael and Patricia, is there anything you would like to add?
Just with the listening bit, smiling and making eye contact and letting the other person see by the way you're concentrating on them that they matter.
Nothing further.
We've had Soph has given the Young Christian Climate Network a shout out when we were talking about how to engage in climate activism. And Ross has said, thank you everyone for this rich and informative conversation. So you're very welcome, Ross. The one thing I would add as well, if people are thinking about how they might want to engage in any kind of social justice issue, whether that's through activism or through volunteering or just through finding out more, we have a social action directory on our website as well, where people can go and search for social justice themes that they're passionate about, whether that's peace, the climate, animal welfare, mental health, disability. There's a whole list of topics. So you can go to our movement website and look at that and search and find organisations in your area or nationally that are working on those issues that have different opportunities to get involved with. Or drop me an email if anybody's got any questions about how to get involved in social action. I'm around for another month before my contract comes to an end. But yeah, I guess the only other thing to say is thank you so much for our speakers today. It has been really informative and I've learned a lot as well. And I'm also a little bit inspired by all of you and the wonderful work you've done. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
you, Lizzie.
Thank you. God bless.